My name is Jillian Marchant and I'm a PhD researcher with the School of Education at James Cook University. I would like to welcome you to my presentation titled Just Google or Just Research for response-able research contributors. The study presented here is part of my PhD research that focuses on the influence of adult education in the social experiences of adult students that reside in rural communities. As you listen, I would appreciate if you can reflect on aspects of resourcing marginalised groups or individuals, and perhaps seek to input your thoughts after I have finished. When I initiated my PhD study, I found that Google Scholar was a useful way to find information about the inhabitants of rural communities. The literature also cautioned that many adult students residing in rural communities were living in socially deprived circumstances. It was with this understanding that I carefully considered the research approach that would best appreciate the social experiences of adult students without further hindering their social chances. This presentation will refer to the PhD study, but will primarily discuss the methodological approach that I used in the investigation in a way that resources the research contributors. It is anticipated that undertaking the PhD research somewhat enhanced the social responses of those who are among some of the most vulnerable in Australian society. To give you an overview of the presentation, first I shall introduce the study and the ideas from literature that frame the research approach. I shall then briefly discuss the literature that highlights caution and possible approaches for research that involves vulnerable individuals or marginalised groups. I will then give an overview of the research purpose and the research questions that I explore in the PhD study, thereby showing that there is a thorough investigation that is being undertaken through this methodological approach. Next, I will discuss the methodology and how this research is genuinely centred on beneficence rather than simply fulfilling the academic staples that form a PhD dissertation. I shall also discuss the ways in which data collection occurred and the ways in which the research approach was able to offer more immediate benefits for the contributors than simply hoping for future policy changes or resources that may or may not enhance their circumstances. I shall then discuss the findings in terms of two aspects. Firstly, a depiction of the contributors that wish to be resourced to make a social response, and their expectations and the existing outcomes from their resource position. Secondly, the contributors who did not wish for any resources and some of the possible reasons that they refused an opportunity to be otherwise compensated for their participation in the study. I shall then discuss some of the implications when resourcing individuals that allows me to make some conclusions about the possibilities and the tensions in the research process that I have used. In summary, I will consider potential directions for the future of the research using the methodology presented here, especially when researchers anticipate fulfilling their expectations that their research may promote the social chances of those who are most vulnerable in our society. When I first began my investigation on the relationship between social processes and adult education, I was interested in how individuals better their life chances by gaining a position of influence in the decisions that affect them the most. This was a question that I could search in Google, but the information from such a search is far from satisfactory. A search showed that alleviating social deprivation in Australia was currently driven by initiatives founded on social inclusion. The notion of social inclusion as a remedy for social inequities became my next Google search. Originating in Europe, social inclusion initiatives have an almost universal appeal as they offer a remedy to growing social disparities in a globalised world. In view of growing disparity among regions and between individuals within the Australian context, social inclusion became a pillar of contemporary Australian social policy, anticipated by policymakers to alleviate social exclusion. Policy documents identified social exclusion as a term to replace poverty, to describe the deprived living standards of some individuals. This replacement was cited as appropriate primarily because poverty was considered unidimensional and overly focused on economic terms that generate social inequities, rather than looking at other contributing factors. In contrast to poverty, social exclusion was a term promoted to encompass a multiplicity of social forces that lead to the marginalisation of individuals. These forces included low income or underemployment, low educational attainment, or locational disadvantages, such as residing in an area with few resources and services. However, as I came to understand the knowledge that research has generated about social exclusion and social inclusion, it became apparent that great uncertainty exists about these twin concepts. Social exclusion and social inclusion seem ill-defined, existing as both the process of social outcomes and also a state whereby individuals were either included or excluded, or perhaps both at the same time. Social exclusion seemed to describe a process whereby social elements came together to inhibit the response of individuals to social opportunities, and problematically, social inclusion was often endorsed as the actions of the individual to overcome insurmountable socially constructed barriers. Exclusion was therefore argued as socially constructed, but inclusion was argued as achieved through individual efforts. Coincidentally, I reside in an area that displays significant markers for social exclusion. Furthermore, many regions outside of metropolitan Australia have strong indicators of social exclusion, leading to an array of rural areas that may be disadvantaged. Additionally, at this time, it was apparent from research investigations conducted within Australia that despite policy adoption of social inclusion, social exclusion processes have remained the stronger force. This evidence considerably complicated any investigation that sought to improve the social outcomes of individuals through social inclusion. If I was to undertake research that improved the life chances of individuals who were marginalised, I speculated that implementing social inclusion as a research action project would not be useful. Like many others, I wanted my PhD research to offer value to my contributors, my institution and myself. It was not enough to simply offer information in the form of answers to questions, as Google can often do this. Rather, I wanted to generate knowledge for academe, for the benefit of my contributors and for my own satisfaction. As I reviewed the information on the marginalised and social research, I quickly became aware that any investigation on my behalf may serve only to re-emphasise social difference, and therefore generate greater exclusion of the individuals who contribute to my research. I sought a profound understanding of the ethics of engaging with research contributors from marginalised groups. It is possible that as a PhD researcher, my academic and financial status would benefit on the completion of my PhD. It seemed unthinkable to engage with individuals with such potential benefit to myself and with seemingly only a slim chance of benefit to the contributors. Many in such circumstances offered their contributors vouchers or a raffle ticket to win a prize to compensate them for their contribution. However, many like myself may find this method to be inadequate for research where significant social disparities exist. The work of Susan Strieger spoke to my ethical dilemma. Strieger's work highlights that research and policy that may partly take account of previous investigations has done little to assist the circumstances of marginalised individuals, and that research should have direct and meaningful advantage for its contributors. I also turn to the work of Iris Marion Young, who advocates that natural formation of marginalised groups and the election of representatives that can give voice to the concerns of the marginalised is a good objective. Achieving this would also present a dilemma, but significantly, Young's work recommends the resourcing of the marginalised. If my work was to progress to my satisfaction, I would need to find a way to address my research objectives as well as fulfil an ethical obligation to the contributors by resourcing them in a significant way. For a moment, I shall turn to the purpose of my research, which did not initially seek to directly benefit the contributors, but rather sought to understand their social experiences as adult learners that reside in rural communities. Understanding these social experiences would allow me to speculate on the role of education in social outcomes in rural areas, not only for the individuals who engage with education, but also the influences in social processes in rural communities. This is especially significant in Australia as legislative changes coupled with technological advances gives residents in rural areas unprecedented access to education opportunities that were previously only available in metropolitan or densely populated areas. This access to education in the form of distance learning is growing. However, there is uncertainty about the social outcomes from an increased adult learner population in rural areas. The following research questions are proposed in order to understand the reported social experiences of adult learners in rural communities. First, how do the reports of adult students detail their involvement in social activities? This offers contributors the chance to reflect on their social involvement, either within or outside of their communities. It also allows an occasion for the contributors to attribute a value to their social activities and identify the connections that are important or those that they would prefer to avoid. Second, how do the reports of adult students describe the arrangements of social structures? In the course of their social engagement, individuals may discover arrangements that greatly assist or restrict their social endeavours. Again, these arrangements may be found within their community, but as distance learners, they may also engage with social networks that are further afield. Third, how do the reports of adult students result their positions of social influence or the social activities in social structures that provide social membership? To return to the question of the ways in which individuals influence the decisions that affect them the most, This question turns to the activities within existing structures that may provide social membership or offer a description of the social activities that provide appropriate social influence in existing social structures. Taken together, these questions serve to reflect on the reports of contributors about the influence of education on the social processes in rural communities. Semi-structured interviews were used in this study to capture the narratives of the adult students. The interview method allows the contributors to communicate their social experiences and allows the researcher to clarify points of their reports that serve the research questions. 21 adult students that were either studying in a non-compulsory course or had recently attained their qualifications were recruited to contribute to this study. The contributors resided in rural communities across South Australia in areas that generally had strong indicators that policymakers would identify as related to markers for social exclusion, including communities experiencing low or underemployment, low educational attainment, and usually diminishing services and resources, in addition to incomes that were reliant on a competitive edge in global markets. The contributors themselves were between the ages of 28 to 70 and represented by a majority of women who suffered from illness or injury and were generally living below the poverty line, often as full-time carers for others. Some experienced other deprivations, such as being homeless. The education attainment of the contributors ranged from a qualification, a step past the South Australian Certificate of Education, a leaving qualification, to a PhD. The interviews with the contributors were recorded and transcribed, and each transcription has been approved by the contributor for use in this study. The data is being analysed in vivo in line with an inductive approach to understand the significance of social activities, social arrangements, and the social influence of adult learners both within and outside of their communities. Importantly, each contributor has been offered an equivalent amount of the researcher's time for the time they have donated to me. It is anticipated that this is the way that as a researcher I can resource marginalised contributors. Some contributors have eagerly engaged with me and spent time with me to fulfil their social goals, whereas others express the view that they will not need anything in return. I shall first discuss the outcomes for those who have seized the opportunity and then consider those contributors who have expressed that they do not require my assistance. And in doing this, I will be able to answer the question, how many have been socially resourced? Approximately 10 contributors enlisted my help after the interview process was completed. I was able to offer a considerable amount of my time to these contributors to assist them with self-identified goals. I assisted them in a broad spectrum of ways, from helping with funding applications to discussing further education options to assisting them with seeking employment. I offered my services in a fairly broad range of aspects that allowed the contributors to call upon me and fulfil the following goals that they identified as significant for them, which included securing funding, a complete suite of policy documents, attaining employment, engaging with a committee for the first time, forming social groups for the community, and enrolling in an education course after they had completed their qualification. It is hoped that my time that was allocated according to the interests of the contributor also served their communities, often through boosting the strength of social groups within their communities. Around 50% of the contributors were resourced with my time so that they may achieve some steps in their social goals. However, that leaves half of the contributors who were not resourced in any way. Some of these contributors are yet to call upon me as they need time to think about where I would be best placed to help them. Others consider me as a reserve resource to be called upon in further times of anticipated educational difficulties. As one contributor put it, he perceives me as an ace up the sleeve for when he receives a particularly difficult assignment that he needs help with. It is gratifying to be placed in such a position by someone who contributed 2.5 hours of his time to me. The last group of contributors have expressly stated that they do not need or want anything from me. It is their statement that their contribution of time to my work is a gift. In being able to offer me a social gift, these contributors have cemented a social status which means they can give something to me without the need of reciprocity. I would like to think that the opportunity for them to demonstrate that they are in a position to give has offered them some esteem in regard to their social capacities. This esteem may occur despite some of the contributors who wish for nothing in return remaining in some of the more dire social circumstances. Research with marginalised individuals is not an easy task. Googling may help with answers to some questions, but our interaction with information as researchers can produce knowledge outcomes, not only for ourselves and our institution, but also in ways that resource our contributors. This small study has shown that a simple social engagement with a contributor resources elegant insights and solutions for the dilemmas faced by themselves and their communities. If we are to avoid imposing our mistakes in their circumstances, assisting individuals in their autonomous decisions about their futures is also a substantial element of this research protocol. Understandably, it may be argued that this research design and number of contributors lends itself to improving social outcomes. However, with different proposals or greater numbers, it is invigorating for research to consider existing practices that engage microscopic investigations of the marginalised that result in little or no change in circumstances by either research or policy means. And if we were to start thinking in terms of resourcing contributors in meaningful ways, what would such research designs and their outcomes look like? Thank you for listening to my presentation today. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to contact me on the email address below. Thank you.